Yeah, I appreciate that as somebody who's endured mass casualty events, to be able to be prepared for that, or at least have the call-up ability to do that. I think that's something that I hope that we can look into as a Congress to consider that type of reserve workforce that's ready to go on day one. As of February 2024, VAERS reports for COVID-19 vaccines total significantly higher than all other vaccines combined since 1990, as reported. This is a surprising figure. Dr. Marks, was the government prepared for such an avalanche of reports to VAERS? And it kind of goes with what we just mentioned. So.
Chair Wenstrup, thank you so much for that question, and I apologize about your name before. It shows when you're nervous, things can happen. But the point is extremely well taken. We tried to be prepared for that, but the avalanche of reports was tremendous, and it again required retasking people on the fly I think and I'll let my CDC colleagues speak to this. We had to hugely staff up and had many meetings working to increase our ability to go through these reports, because, as you already mentioned, what the public sees on the public VAERS page is just a small fraction of the information that we ultimately collect and sift through that is very important to determining whether an adverse event is truly related to the vaccine. Now, one of the criticisms that we often receive is that we don't make that additional information available. And I would say to you that it's a challenge, because what we've learned is it's very challenging to make available essentially protected health information, because if you have a zip code that someone was pregnant, if you have a zip code of someone in Akron, Ohio, that they were pregnant and they had COVID, you can potentially re-identify them. So this is one of the challenges we face in making available information, but I think we'd like to work to make the most information available as possible.
Do you have any concept on that, Dr. Marks, as far as this number? Childhood vaccines, they are spaced out. This was a vaccine that was being administered to would it be a larger swath of the population? Was the number higher, but maybe the same per capita, if you will? Does that make sense, the question?
Yeah, so I can't think, our seasonal influenza campaigns often administer about 150 million doses over the course of a number of months. Here we had millions of doses rolled out really on top of each other at a tremendously rapid rate. And in addition, we encouraged people. The part of the emergency use authorization process, we were encouraging safety reporting because we felt we needed to know any potential adverse events so we could try to investigate and find out if there was something we were missing.
Did you have anything to add to that, Dr. Jerne?
No, I think that covered along.
I now recognize Dr. Ruiz for questioning.
Today's hearing comes at a pivotal time in the ongoing efforts to fortify declining vaccine confidence, one of the greatest public health challenges of our time. And I agree with the chairman, words matter. And what we say here today will have significant ramifications on whether millions of Americans will continue to place their trust in safe and effective vaccines, including the COVID-19 vaccine. Before I get to my question, I'd like to enter into the record a letter the Select Subcommittee received from more than 50 medical and public health organizations and experts ahead of today's hearing. Here you go.
Without objection.
This letter, which was led by Vaccinate Your Family and signed by a broad coalition that includes the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, the National Association of County and City Health Officials, the American Public Health Association, the American Heart Association, Doctors for America, and many more, warns us of the potential damage that could be done if today's hearing fails to handle the subject of vaccine safety carefully and without bias. And just this morning, a group of 6 leading medical societies representing more than 560,000 physicians, issued a joint statement with a similar warning, calling on the Select Subcommittee to, quote, acknowledge the overwhelming evidence-based science and recognize how COVID-19 vaccines protect and save millions of lives. I'd also like to enter this statement into the record.
Without objection.
Now, as a physician and as ranking member of this Select Subcommittee, I want to ensure that today's conversation remains rooted in the facts. And the facts are that while delivering effective COVID-19 vaccines to the American people at a historic pace, our federal public health officials went to painstaking lengths to evaluate their safety, and they are continuing to do so. Dr. Marks, your division of the FDA is responsible for evaluating clinical trial data to authorize and approve products, including the COVID-19 vaccine. Could you please explain for us the rigorous standards the FDA has followed in its authorization and approval processes for the COVID-19 vaccines?
Thanks so much for that question, Ranking Member Ruiz. The COVID-19 vaccines, before we even started to receive data, we put forth guidance first in April and then subsequently in October of 2020, which described our expectations for the safety and the efficacy of these vaccines. That's the standard that we would use before we could issue an emergency use authorization. We then, for the initial emergency use authorization, required manufacturing data that was equal to what we would have, or nearly equal to what we would have required for a biologics license application. And we required effectiveness data that was near or equal to what we would have required for a biologics license application. We couldn't speed up time, so in order to get the vaccines to people in need when thousands of people were dying, we actually allowed the safety to be authorized with just 2 months of median follow-up rather than the normal 6 to 12, but we were confident that that would capture adverse events. So we had good safety data. And then when we went to finally do the biologics license application, we go through very large data sets. For instance, the Pfizer vaccine had 43,000 people involved in clinical trials, about 22,000 of whom had received the vaccine initially, and then thousands more received it after 6 months. So we went through a tremendous amount of data, looked at the adverse events, and looked at the effectiveness data. So that plus looking carefully at the manufacturing.
And what has the clinical trial data shown regarding the safety of the COVID-19 vaccines?
The safety of the COVID-19 vaccines includes that there are some initial discomfort, potentially in the arm, fatigue that could occur, and there are rarely more serious side effects. We identified myocarditis and rare allergic reactions, and thankfully by putting mitigation strategies in place, both of those have been decreased in occurrence.
Dr. Jernigan, your division at CDC is responsible for operating surveillance systems that detect adverse health effects, mild or serious. Could you please explain the multi-tiered system that CDC has in place to monitor for safety concerns regarding vaccines that have been brought to market?
Sure, thanks for the question. Like I said, we've been putting through the most intensive vaccine safety monitoring in U.S. history, and that at CDC includes 5 different systems. The first of those is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System that we talked about, which is essentially an open door to get those reports in. The second is the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is a very large electronic health records, about 13.5 million records in it, where we look for trends. We have a pregnancy monitoring system. We have a smartphone-enabled app called vSafe, and we have a clinician immunization safety assessment program where we have medical experts that can then provide input into the safety monitoring. That system has been tremendous at us being able to follow what's going on with vaccine issues. What we've found so far, at least with the Vaccine Safety Data Link, is that there are lower rates of death in those that are vaccinated compared to the unvaccinated. And there are lower rates of cardiac complications compared to those that have been unvaccinated. What we're looking for in that VAERS system and in these other systems is for signals of things that might be a problem that we need to follow up on. I think this process works. We were able to find, like we mentioned in our opening statements, that there were 6 cases of a blood clot problem, the very rare problem that we identified very early. We were able to communicate that to clinicians, communicate that, and follow a science-based process that we have at CDC, where the science is evaluated, the data is analyzed, it's provided to the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, and we know that the committee advises and provides it to the director to decide. So that process, that science-based process, is what we've been following, utilizing the data from the data.
So let's talk about the VAERS for a second. So that is a system where individuals can report their symptoms that they believe may be associated with the vaccine. How do you then determine if it in fact is associated with the vaccine or it's not associated with the vaccine?
Yeah, so if, VAERS is it's essentially a front door where anybody
It's a
has
screening mechanism.
correct.
Yeah.
People can put in anything that they think may be associated with that vaccine. That means that we have a lot of reports that may not exactly be associated with the vaccine, but there's a process for reviewing those. Every serious adverse event in VAERS is followed up. Medical records are collected, and autopsy records are collected to identify that. We don't use VAERS to determine if an adverse event is caused by the vaccine. We don't use it to look at trends about whether the vaccine is more commonly causing a problem versus what's in the general population. We use different data sets to do that.
So one can't subscribe the data from VAERS to being the actual rate of death or serious illness, because that is a initial screening, and then the investigation that occurs afterwards will determine whether it was in fact related to the vaccine or not.
Correct.
So then there are cases, for example, where death was reported that you found that it wasn't due to the vaccine, correct?
Correct. So, for instance, a hospice patient who is one of the more vulnerable people that we do want to get vaccinated, they may have a standing order for do not resuscitate. And so that patient may die 2 days after getting the vaccine, which really may not be associated with the vaccine. There are reports of vehicle injury in folks that have been vaccinated. There are even reports of family members who died for caring for a vaccinated patient, but the death was not in the vaccinated patient who had not been vaccinated. So there are a number of those reports, but what we want is to be able to say, what's the impact of those vaccines, and we look to other data sets to really give us that information.
Thank you. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, this rigorous surveillance system has demonstrated its effectiveness for the COVID-19 vaccines, detecting exceedingly rare cases of thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, or TTS, among patients who received the J&J vaccine, for example. Dr. Jernigan, could you explain how the detection of these cases reflects the effectiveness of CDC's vaccine safety surveillance system?
Yeah, I think these indicate that the process works. You mentioned the TTS associated with the J&J vaccine. The systems have been able to pick up myocarditis and show that the risk of getting myocarditis is much lower among those vaccinated than among those that were unvaccinated. It's even a system that we've been able to pick up signals that turn out not to be signals. So a thing called ischemic stroke can occur, and we picked up a signal, but when we continued to follow it, it went away. So we get signals that sometimes are there, sometimes aren't, but it allows us to see things early so that we can act quickly and change recommendations when needed.
Thank you. And Dr. Marks, my understanding is that following the detection of these cases, FDA limited the use of the J&J vaccine. Could you explain how FDA reached this decision?
Ranking Member Weiss, thank you for that question. So we evaluated the data that came in regarding the vaccine itself, the J&J vaccine. There were also there was another vaccine that was like that vaccine that was being used outside of the United States, which had a similar issue. We looked at the totality of those data, and then we changed the fact sheets for providers and for patients, making a recommendation that this not be kind of the first line vaccine to be used, but that it be used in those where a single dose vaccine, which that particular vaccine was desirable rather than a 2-dose regimen.
And so in this instance, our surveillance systems worked as designed, detecting rare but serious adverse events and informing a policy decision to best protect patients and consumers. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what would you say to Americans who may believe that action taken to address rare adverse events with the J&J vaccines draw into question the safety of the broader universe of COVID-19 vaccines?
I would say that I think what we see here in vaccine safety surveillance that may be confusing for the public sometimes is that as an amateur radio operator, I sometimes listen to very weak signals, and sometimes that means you turn up the gain. We have the gain of our vaccine safety surveillance system turned up very high. That's the ability to detect signals. That means sometimes we hear things that turn out not to be true, as Dr. Jernigan just noted. I think we have the gain turned up high, and we've appropriately found signals, and we continue to look for signals. We sometimes find them, and as I speak, we're in the process of evaluating whether there are signals that have been detected are real or whether they turn out to be just a statistical anomaly.
So I'm not an amateur radio guy, I'm a doctor, and it kind of sounds what you're talking about is specificity and or sensitivity. And so, you know, it sounds like we want to detect as much as we can and then rule out the false positives, correct?
So in doctor's language, sorry.
Yeah.
This is the idea here is indeed to have a very sensitive system to pick up any signal. And then we then go back and try to make sure it's truly related to the vaccine. Thank you.
So, I hope my colleagues will heed the warnings we received ahead of today's hearings and keep our discussions rooted in objective information. Public confidence in vaccines, which have saved millions of lives and continue to be the most significant public health intervention of our time, is not something that should be undermined for partisan gain. So I thank you and I yield back.
I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Comer from Kentucky, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about the vaccine approval process and some safety signals that were downplayed. Dr. Marks, Pfizer submitted their full approval application on May 18th, 2021, correct?
That's correct.
And January 18th, 2022 was the original required action due date, correct?
That's correct.
And you worked with Dr. Philip Krause and Dr. Marian Gruber on this, correct? Thank you. When Pfizer submitted the application, Dr. Krause and Dr. Gruber oversaw the approval process. According to documents and testimony, they believe they could and should approve the vaccine faster than 8 months. They proposed the end of October 2021. You, Dr. Marks, requested September 15th, 2021. They hesitated but obliged. You, Dr. Marks, then said you wanted it approved even faster than September 15th, but they declined. According to them, after they declined, you and former FDA Commissioner Janet Woodcock relieved them from the roles in the approval process. They said that they felt, quote, substantial pressure, unquote, from you to approve this vaccine faster than they thought was defensible. My question is, did anyone instruct you to speed up the approval timeline faster than September 15th, 2021?
Chair Comer, thank you for that question. I think it deserves an explanation, but what was going on during that summer that changed the situation was in the week ending July 10th of 2021, there were 1,645 deaths. In the week ending August 14th, there were 9,406 deaths. There were an increasing number of deaths from COVID-19, and there was clear knowledge that having an approved vaccine would help Americans feel more comfortable getting vaccinated. So we felt speeding up the vaccine approval process.
So let me interrupt. Did anyone instruct you, or is this just a decision you made on your own?
This was a decision that I had made on my own.
So why were you pressuring the doctors and then removing them from the approval process when they disagreed?
The approval process was one that was needed to move as rapidly as possible. One of the physicians.
Okay, let me, we may go back to that. Do you recall any conversations regarding the need to approve the vaccines in order for it to then be mandated?
There was an acknowledgement that an approval could allow vaccine mandates to occur, but they were not conversations over that it were.
So Dr. Gruber wrote that you and Dr. Woodcock expressed your opinion that absent a license, states cannot require mandatory vaccination. Do you recall this conversation?
I don't know what you're referring to, but there's probably it's just a statement of fact that once you have a licensed vaccine, a mandate could be placed.
Do you recall why Dr. Gruber and Dr. Krause expressed concern about accelerating the approval of the vaccine?
They were concerned about the workload.
Okay. Dr. Gruber wrote that taking a thorough approach was important because of increasing evidence of association of this vaccine and development of myocarditis, especially in young men. Do you recall seeing safety signals regarding myocarditis in young men during this time?
There were safety signals known, and they were placed on the label. But Chair Comer,
Let me finish. Did you ever have any conversations regarding the vaccine approval with the Department of Defense?
I can't recall any conversation directly with the Department of Defense.
Did anyone else at FDA have conversations regarding the vaccine approval with Department of Defense?
I can't speak to the conversation of others I'm just not aware of.
Did you express your desire to approve the vaccine by August 20th?
I did.
And it was ultimately approved on August 23rd, correct?
Correct.
And just for the record, the military mandate was issued on the 24th. And that is interesting timing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I